A young violinist battles rivalry, family secrets, and crushing expectations at an elite conservatory, struggling to find her true voice as ambition, fear, and fragile hope collide around her.
The conservatory was less a place of music and more a crucible, a place where every note I played was a measured breath against the looming threat of failure. The polished wooden floors echoed with the footsteps of prodigies, each step a silent claim to survival. My violin case felt heavier with every passing day, weighed down not just by the instrument within, but by the fragile scholarship that tethered me to this world. I pulled my dark hair back tightly, the strands slick against my scalp from hours lost in the practice room. The low hum of the air conditioning was punctuated only by the scratch of bow against strings. The quivering notes a mirror of my own nerves. Each vibration carried the weight of dreams mine, and those abandoned by my father long ago. The halls whispered secrets. Shadows stretched long beneath the chandeliers, and in every corner, ambition lurked like a predator. I caught sight of Vivian Sharp for the first time today. Her presence was magnetic, sharp, almost predatory. Striking, with a gaze that seemed to dissect rather than observe, she moved with the confidence of someone who believed the world was hers to command. Our eyes met briefly, a silent war waged in a fraction of a second. I turned away, heart pounding, the cold edge of rivalry settling in my chest. Marcus Lee sat at the corner table in the cafeteria, his tousled brown hair a stark contrast to the rigid formality of the conservatory. His gentle eyes met mine, offering a small, reassuring smile. In this place where trust was scarce, his presence was a fragile tether to something human, something real. But even his calm was tinged with the quiet competition that shadowed us all. I retreated to the practice rooms, the familiar scent of rosin and polished wood grounding me. The notes I coaxed from my violin were tentative at first, then gathering strength, each phrase a fragile thread woven from years of sacrifice. Yet beneath the music, a quiet tremor of doubt flickered. Could I truly hold my place here? Memories of my father surfaced unbidden, his laughter, the way his fingers danced over strings like magic, and then, the silence that followed his disappearance. My family's past was a glass house, beautiful but fragile, prone to shattering with the slightest tremor. I bore the shards in my heart, a constant reminder of what was lost and what I must now protect. The conservatory's grand hall was empty now, the weight of unseen eyes lingering in the air. I paused at the window, watching rain streak down the glass, the world outside blurred and uncertain. The sound of my own breathing seemed loud in the quiet, a metronome counting down the moments before the next challenge. Tomorrow, the competition would begin. Vivian's shadow loomed large, and the stakes had never felt higher. But beneath the tension, a fragile hope flickered that in the delicate balance of ambition and vulnerability, I might find my own voice. The strings of glass that bound me were strong, but they could also break, and I was learning how to play despite the cracks. As the night deepened, I returned to my violin, bow in hand, ready to face the music and whatever came with it. The sound of violin strings filled the conservatory's grand hall, weaving through the warm afternoon light that spilled in from the tall windows. Each note from my instrument was soaked in the tension that clung to the air, thick and almost tangible. Across the room, Vivian Sharp stood poised, her posture perfect and her gaze sharp as a hawk's, watching me with a predatory calm that sent a ripple of unease through my chest. I tightened my grip on the bow, the familiar smoothness of wood grounding me, even as my heart fluttered like a trapped bird. Vivian's cold smile never wavered, but I could see the subtle flicker of calculation in her eyes, the way her lips curled, just so when she thought no one was looking, like she was savoring some private victory. It was a silent game she played, one of shadows and whispers, and I was painfully aware I was the target. After rehearsal, I made my way to the practice rooms, my footsteps echoing softly against the polished floors. The halls felt colder now, the sunlight fading into a pale glow that did little to warm the chill settling in my bones. I paused outside a door where Marcus was already seated at the piano, his fingers dancing lightly over the keys, coaxing out a melody that wrapped around me like a soft blanket. He looked up, his gentle eyes meeting mine with unspoken understanding. "Tough day?" he asked quietly. I nodded, the weight of the rivalry pressing down on me. "Vivian." She's relentless," Marcus interrupted, a knowing smile tugging at his lips. "But you stronger than you think, Elise." His words were a balm, quiet but powerful, steadying the tremor in my hands. I sank onto the bench beside him, letting the music fill the spaces where doubt had begun to creep. Yet even in the warmth of that room, the shadows followed. Memories surfaced sharp and unwelcome like the echo of a broken string. My father's absence, a silent wound that never quite healed, whispered through my mind. I could almost hear the fading notes of his violin, the promises unkept, the dreams abandoned. That night, I wandered the conservatory's dim corridors alone, the muffled sounds of late practice sessions swirling around me like ghosts. The silence was both a comfort and a torment. I pressed my palm against the cool wall, grounding myself in the present, even as the past tugged relentlessly at my resolve. The next day, the tension thickened. In a group rehearsal, Vivian's barbs sliced through the music like a scalpel. Her words were coated with politeness but laced with venom, designed to undermine without overt cruelty. I felt the sting, sharp and sudden, but I held my ground, meeting her gaze with a quiet defiance that surprised even me. Marcus caught my eye from across the room, a small, encouraging nod passing between us. Henry sat nearby, his steady presence a silent reminder that I was not alone in this crucible. The competition loomed larger every day, its shadow stretching over every note I played and every breath I took. But with Marcus's friendship as my anchor, I found the strength to face the mounting pressure. I knew the path ahead would be fraught with challenges, but I was determined to endure, to play each note not just for the scholarship that kept me here, but for the fragile dreams that still flickered within me. And as the echoes of the hall faded into the night, I whispered to myself a quiet vow. I would not let the sound of failure be the last music I ever made. The days that followed blurred into a relentless rhythm of practice, rehearsal, and guarded encounters. Vivian's presence was a constant, a shadow that stretched over every corner of the conservatory. Her tactics became more apparent, a whispered rumor here, a cutting remark there, each designed to chip away at my confidence without drawing direct confrontation. I found myself retreating more often into the sanctuary of my music, fingers aching from hours of practice, but heart aching more from the invisible wounds inflicted by rivalry. Marcus remained my steadfast confidant, his calm demeanor a counterpoint to the storm raging within me. Our conversations, though few and often brief, were lifelines tossed across the turbulent waters. One afternoon, after a grueling rehearsal, Marcus caught me in the hallway, his expression serious yet kind. "Alice," he said softly, "don't forget why you play. Not for them, not for the scholarships or the competition, but for you." His words struck a chord deeper than any I had anticipated, resonating with the fragile hope I tried so desperately to protect. In that moment, the walls I'd built around myself seemed to tremble, revealing cracks I hadn't dared to acknowledge. But just as solace threatened to settle, the past came crashing back with a vengeance. A chance encounter with an older professor, a stray comment about my father's name, reopened old wounds and sent me spiraling into a familiar abyss of self-doubt. The abandonment I'd tried to bury resurfaced, its weight heavier than ever. Yet amid the turmoil, I felt a flicker of something new, a resolve shaped not by fear or desperation, but by a growing understanding of my own strength and fragility intertwined. The competition was no longer just a test of skill, but a crucible for my very identity. As the chapter of this day closed, I stood at the edge of a precipice, the echo of the hall ringing in my ears like a challenge. The road ahead was uncertain, but I was determined to meet it head-on, bow in hand, heart open, and spirit unbroken. And so, with the notes of my violin trembling in the quiet air, I stepped forward into the battle that awaited, ready to face whatever came next. The dim glow of the conservatory's evening lights cast long shadows across the polished wooden floor as I sat hunched over my violin, my bow hesitating midair. The scales I was practicing dissolved into a silence that was abruptly broken by the faintest murmur of voices drifting from the hallway beyond the practice rooms. I froze, heart tightening. At first, it was just a whisper, fragments of words that seemed to thread through the air, barely audible but unmistakably laden with tension. Curiosity, like a fragile tremor, compelled me to move closer to the door, cracked open just enough to catch the hushed exchange. "She doesn't know the full story," a voice said, soft, cautious. "It's better she doesn't," replied another, smoother, authoritative. I recognized the first as a teacher, perhaps one of the administrative staff, and the second voice belonged to someone I'd only recently glimpsed in fleeting moments around the conservatory, an older, distinguished figure whose presence always seemed to ripple with unspoken authority. Her father's past. "It's more complicated than anyone lets on," the first voice continued. "He left not just because of failure, but because of something darker." A chill slithered along my spine. I pressed my ear closer, the violin's varnished surface cold against my cheek. If she knew, it might shatter her. But the scholarship board is already watching closely. Any hint of scandal, and it could be over. The door clicked softly as footsteps receded down the hall. I staggered back into the room, clutching the violin like a lifeline. The weight of everything I'd tried so hard to suppress pressed down on me, my father's abandonment. The whispers of failure that had haunted me since childhood, now tangled with the fear of losing my place here. Music should have been my refuge, but that night it felt like a battleground. The next morning, the conservatory buzzed with the usual undercurrent of rivalry and ambition. Vivian Sharp swept through the hallways with an air of unshackable confidence, her sharp eyes cutting like knives. During rehearsal, her pointed remarks and icy smirks aimed at me were impossible to ignore. "Careful, Elise," she said during a particularly challenging passage. "Slipping up now would be unfortunate." Her words were barbed, but beneath her confidence, I sensed a restless edge, as if she, too, was grappling with something fragile beneath the surface of her polished exterior. It wasn't only Vivian. Sophie Kim, whose ambition had always been a quiet undercurrent in the conservatory, began to show cracks too. One afternoon, while we both took a break in the conservatory garden, the tension between us softened. "You play with such fire," Sophie said, her voice barely above a whisper, "but sometimes, I wonder if it's enough, if I'm enough." Her vulnerability surprised me. For a moment, the rivalry dissolved, replaced by a fragile understanding. We shared stories of pressure, of expectations that felt like weights around our necks. "Sometimes," I admitted, "I feel like I'm holding glass strings, one wrong move, and everything shatters." She nodded, eyes reflecting the late afternoon sun. "Maybe we were all just trying to find balance on those strings." That evening, back in my room, I let the violin speak the words I could not. Each note trembled with the conflict inside me, the fear, the anger, the desperate hope. The sound filled the small space, a fragile melody echoing the fractures beneath my carefully maintained exterior. The truth about my father's past was a shadow I could no longer ignore. It haunted the edges of every note, every practice session. But as painful as it was, it also lit a fierce flame of determination. I would not let the fractures define me. I would fight for my music, for my place, for myself. Yet as the days passed, the rivalry with Vivian grew sharper, her tactics more cutting. Sophie's presence lingered as both a challenge and an unexpected ally, complicating the landscape of competition and friendship. The conservatory, once a place of dreams, now felt like a fragile glass sculpture, beautiful, intricate, and on the verge of breaking. And I stood at its center, the weight of ambition and vulnerability pressing down, wondering how much I could bear before the strings snapped. The notes quivered in the silence, waiting for me to choose, to let go or to hold on tighter than ever. But what I did not yet know was that the fractures beneath the surface were only the beginning, and that the most shattering revelations were still to come. The sound of failure was close, but so was the sound of resilience, waiting to be found in the spaces between the broken pieces. And I was forced to ask myself, how far was I willing to go to keep my place in this world of fragile brilliance? The answer lay hidden in the next note, just beyond the edge of fear. The conservatory's practice rooms were sanctuaries and prisons alike small, windowless chambers where silence was both a blessing and a curse. I had spent countless hours in one such room, my violin a constant companion, its strings a fragile thread tying me to a dream that felt increasingly tenuous. That afternoon, as a waning sun cast a pale light through the dusty air vents, I found myself under the unblinking gaze of Professor Alcott. His presence was imposing, not because of any loud command but because of the quiet weight he carried a lifetime of music, regret, and relentless pursuit of perfection. "Play," he said simply, his voice low but carrying a gravity that made my fingers tremble. I drew my bow across the strings, the sound uneven at first, wavering like a heartbeat uncertain of its rhythm. The notes faltered, breaking into hesitant fragments. Professor Alcott's eyes narrowed, not in impatience but in focused scrutiny. Again he instructed, but this time with feeling. Without armor, I swallowed hard. Feeling was a battleground where I had long been hesitant to tread. My music had always been precise, calculated, a fortress of technical skill to shield my deepest fears. But Alcott wanted more. He wanted the music to bleed, to reveal the vulnerabilities I kept buried beneath my practiced faade. "Your technique is admirable," he continued, stepping closer, "but what stifles you is not your fingers. It is your heart. You play to hide, not to reveal." His words unsettled me, stirring a storm of emotions I had tried to suppress. I nodded, though uncertainty gnawed at me. How could I lay bare the fractured pieces of myself when every mistake threatened to topple the fragile scholarship that kept me here? The following days blurred into an obsessive cycle. Practice sessions stretched into the late hours, my bow slicing the air with increasing desperation. The strings became my confessional, each note a plea, a cry, a tremor of hope and fear intertwined. Yet, the sound of failure lingered like a shadow, just beyond my reach, its whisper threading through the melodies and silences alike. Late one evening, I found myself pacing my cramped dorm room, violin cradled in my arms as if it were both lifeline and burden. The muffled sounds of the conservatory at night, the distant footsteps, the soft rustling of sheet music, the faint hum of a piano somewhere down the hall wove through my thoughts. I was caught between worlds, the disciplined precision demanded by the conservatory and the chaotic emotions stirring within me. Professor Alcott's mentorship was a paradox. He was stern, sometimes unyielding, but beneath that sternness lay a yearning to see his students transcend their limitations. He shared little of his own past, but the occasional glimpse, a sigh, a distant look hinted at regrets he carried as deeply as I did my fears. One afternoon, after a grueling practice where frustration threatened to unravel me, he spoke quietly. "Music is not just sound, Elise. It is the silent spaces between notes, the breath before a phrase, the truth that trembles beneath the surface. You must find that truth." His words resonated, but the path to that truth was jagged. Each session left me raw, peeling away layers of control and certainty. I wrestled with doubts, with the echoes of my father's abandonment, with the relentless pressure to prove myself. The conservatory's legacy was a heavy cloak, its weight pressing down like the very silence in which I practiced. Yet, amid the tension, there were moments of fragile breakthrough. A phrase would catch fire with emotion. A passage would flow not from calculation, but from something deeper. Those moments were fleeting but intoxicating, the promise of what I could become if I could just silence the fears that held me captive. As the chapter of these days unfolded, I realized that Professor Alcott's challenge was not merely to improve my playing, but to embrace the vulnerability that made music and life worth living. The silent strings within me were beginning to hum, faintly but unmistakably. Still, the shadow of failure haunted every note, a reminder that the path ahead was treacherous. Could I find the courage to play not just with skill but with heart? The question lingered in the quiet spaces, waiting for an answer only time could reveal. And so, with trembling hands and a restless spirit, I returned to the practice room, ready to face the silent strings once more. The conservatory's corridors thrummed with a restless energy that day, the kind that scratched under the skin and set nerves jangling like the strings of a violin stretched too tight. I felt it the moment I stepped into the practice room, the air thick with the scent of rosin and polished wood. A place that should have been sanctuary, but instead promised conflict. Vivian Sharp stood near the window, her posture flawless as always, her sharp gaze slicing through the dim light. I tightened my grip on my violin, the familiar weight a small comfort against the storm brewing inside me. You think you can keep this scholarship just by playing safe? Vivian's voice was low but cold, each word deliberate, meant to unsettle. She didn't need to raise her voice. The threat hung between us like a fine wire ready to snap. I swallowed the lump in my throat, trying to steady the tremor in my fingers. I'm not playing safe. I'm playing true. Her laugh was a brittle thing, sharp as broken glass. Truth doesn't win competitions, Elise. Power does. Influence, connections, stepping on whoever's in your way. You will learn that soon enough. The echo of her words stirred a bitter ache. I wanted to believe there was more to music than ruthless ambition, but the conservatory's unforgiving atmosphere whispered otherwise. Our violins sang out, a duel of notes, hers precise and cutting, mine raw and searching. Each phrase we played was a challenge, a declaration of intent. The tension wound tighter with every bar, the room shrinking until it felt like only our breaths and the clash of strings existed. After the final note faded, silence settled, heavy and accusing. Vivian's smirk was a wound I couldn't ignore. I left the room with my heart pounding, the sting of humiliation mingling with a fierce determination. This fight was far from over. Later, in the quieter sanctuary of the piano room, Marcus sat with his shoulders hunched, fingers tracing idle patterns on the keys. The soft cadence of the keys was a comfort, a small rebellion against the chaos outside. I don't know if I can do this, he admitted, voice barely above a whisper. Sometimes, I feel like I'm just faking it, like everyone else has a piece of the puzzle I'm missing. I met his gaze, surprised by the vulnerability in his usually calm eyes. You're not alone, I said quietly. We're all fighting shadows here, but maybe if we don't pretend, we can find a way through. The silence that followed was less heavy, a fragile truce born of shared doubts. In the bustling hallway, Henry's presence was a steady beacon. His easy smile and warm words cut through the tension that clung to me like a second skin. You're stronger than you think, he said, offering a reassuring nod. Don't let them make you forget why you love this music. I clung to that moment of kindness, a fleeting refuge from the relentless pressure. As night fell, I found myself by the grand window of my dormitory, the city's lights blurred by rain. The steady patter against the glass was a soft counterpoint to the storm inside. I traced the droplets with a finger, thinking of the fractures running through my trust in Vivian, in myself, in the fragile alliances that wavered under the weight of ambition. Could I survive in this world where every note carried the risk of failure, every friendship the threat of betrayal? The question lingered, unanswered, as the night deepened around me. But beneath the doubt, a quiet flame burned, a resolve shaped by every strained string, every whispered challenge. I would fight for my place here, no matter the cost. And so, as the rain traced its endless patterns, I prepared to face the dissonance within and without, knowing that the next movement in this relentless symphony was yet to come. The confrontation with Vivian had left a bitter aftertaste, but it also crystallized the stakes. The conservatory was no longer just a place of learning. It was a battlefield, each of us armed with our instruments and ambitions, fighting for survival. Vivian wielded her ruthlessness like a weapon, and I had to decide whether to mirror her or forge a different path. Marcus's confession stayed with me, his vulnerability a mirror to my own hidden fears. Behind his calm exterior lay a tempest of self-doubt, a reminder that even those who seem steady carry burdens unseen. Our bond deepened that day, a fragile thread woven from shared struggles and whispered truths. Henry's warmth was a balm, a reminder that amidst the cold calculations and sharp rivalries, humanity endured. His steady presence helped anchor me, though I knew the tides of competition would soon pull us all into unpredictable currents. Each encounter, each conversation chipped away at my defenses. Trust was a rare commodity here, and I guarded it jealously. Yet I yearned for connection, for a sense that I was not alone in this crucible of ambition and fear. The conservatory's halls echoed with footsteps and murmurs, the distant hum of pianos and violins weaving a tapestry of sound that was both beautiful and fraught with tension. Every corner held whispers, every glance a calculation. And I, Elise Morgan, stood in the center of it all, a violinist caught between hope and despair, strength and fragility, ready to face whatever crescendo awaited me. The next notes in this relentless score were mine to play. As the days passed, the lines between friend and rival blurred. Sophie Kim's ambition flared intermittently, her moments of vulnerability complicating the dance of competition. I found myself questioning the nature of rivalry. Was it always adversarial, or could it be a catalyst for growth? Professor Alcott's stern guidance echoed in my mind, urging me to embrace the complexity of my emotions and the contradictions within my music. The conservatory demanded perfection, but it was the imperfect, the nuance, that gave depth to the art. I practiced relentlessly, each session a battle to align my technique with the turmoil inside. The sound of failure, a missed note, a faltering phrase haunted me, but I began to understand it not as defeat, but as a vital part of the journey. In the quiet moments, I revisited memories of my father, the shadow of his abandonment coloring my resolve. His absence was a wound and a motivator, pushing me to prove that I was not defined by loss, but by the strength to continue. The conservatory was a crucible, and I was both the raw material and the smith. The music I created was a reflection of my fractured self, dissonant yet yearning for harmony. And in that tension I found purpose. The dim glow of the conservatory's evening lights flickered faintly as I sat alone in the practice room, the polished wood floor cold beneath my shoes. I had come seeking solace in the familiar curve of my violin, hoping to lose myself in its strings, but instead found a folded scrap of paper tucked beneath the music stand. My fingers trembled as I unfolded it, eyes scanning the neat, chilling script that detailed Vivian's plans to undermine me, a subtle sabotage masked by the guise of camaraderie. It was a cruel strategy, woven with precision and intent to fracture my standing. I stared at the note, disbelief clawing at the edges of my mind. How long had she been playing this game behind my back? The revelation hit me like a sharp note out of tune, jarring and impossible to ignore. Yet beneath the shock, a fierce ember ignited inside me. This was no longer just a competition for survival. It was a war fought in shadows and whispers. I tucked the note away, the weight of it pressing down like the first heavy chord of a symphony that promised both turmoil and triumph. Retreating to my dorm, the silence greeted me like an old adversary. Moonlight spilled through the window, casting long, fragile shadows that danced across the pale walls. I cradled my violin, the smooth wood familiar against my skin, and drew the bow across the strings. The sound was raw and aching, a release of all the fear and doubt that churned beneath my skin. Each note was a fragment of my resolve, fragile yet unyielding, building a fragile sanctuary from the storm raging outside. The next day, the conservatory buzzed with its usual frenetic energy, yet beneath the surface, the atmosphere was charged with an unspoken tension. In the crowded café, I caught Vivian's sharp gaze slicing through the room like a blade. Her eyes held that same intense focus, a silent challenge that tightened the invisible noose around my confidence. I met her stare evenly, refusing to retreat despite the cold pit of anger rising inside me. There was no room for weakness here, not when the stakes were this high. Marcus noticed the change in me, his gentle eyes filled with quiet concern. His steady presence was a balm, a reminder that I wasn't entirely alone in this ruthless arena. Yet even his support felt fragile against the relentless pressure I bore. I could see the strain in his own features, the weight of his insecurities mirroring my own in subtle ways. That night, I found myself drawn once more to the small wooden box on my dresser, where an old photograph of my father lay nestled beside a worn bough. The man in the picture wore a smile that seemed both distant and haunted, a reflection of the dreams he had abandoned. The silence of the room pressed in, amplifying the ache of his absence, a ghost that shadowed every note I played. But beneath the sorrow, a steely determination took root. I would not be defined by the failures that came before me. I would carve my own path, fragile yet fiercely my own. As I tuned my violin in the quiet darkness, the notes shimmered like shards of glass, delicate, sharp, and beautiful in their imperfection. The rivalry with Vivian had shattered the illusion of a simple contest. It was a crucible that would test every fragment of my ambition and resilience. But within the fractures, I glimpsed the possibility of something new, a strength born, not of flawless perfection, but of embracing the vulnerabilities that made me human. The hours slipped by, the music weaving a tapestry of resolve and fragility that wrapped around me like a second skin. Outside my window, the conservatory stood silent, a monument to dreams both realized and broken. Tomorrow, the battle would resume, but tonight, in the shattered reflections of my own making, I found a quiet promise to myself to fight, to endure, and perhaps to rise. The night deepened, and as the last note faded into the stillness, I knew the path ahead would be fraught with pain and uncertainty. Yet the sound of failure no longer echoed just as a threat. It was a part of the music I was learning to master, fragile and fierce in equal measure. The strings of glass I played on could break, yes, but they could also catch the light, and maybe that was enough to carry me forward. The air in the practice room was thick with silence, broken only by the soft, uneven breathing that escaped me. My fingers hovered uncertainly over the violin strings, the familiar weight of the instrument, both a comfort and a burden. The dim light cast long shadows against the peeling walls, and the wooden floor groaned faintly beneath my restless feet. Each breath was an anchor, each heartbeat a drum counting down to the moment I would have to play again. I closed my eyes, willing the tremor in my hands to cease. The notes I had rehearsed 1,000 times were now strangers, as elusive and fragile as glass threads threatening to shatter with the slightest touch. The pressure of the upcoming performance pressed against my chest, a heavy hand that squeezed tighter with every passing day. I was supposed to be ready, had to be ready, but the weight of expectation felt like a noose tightening around my throat. A quiet presence at the door startled me. Marcus' familiar silhouette framed the doorway, his gentle eyes steady and unjudging. He didn't speak, knowing words might only unravel the fragile thread I clung to. Instead, his calm offered a balm, a reminder that I wasn't alone in this relentless storm. Slowly, I lifted my bow and drew it across the strings. The sound that emerged was hesitant, a whisper of melody trembling in the stale air. I faltered, the notes breaking apart like shards of a broken mirror. Again, Professor Alcott's voice sliced through the silence, firm but not unkind. His silver hair caught the light as he stepped forward, his gaze sharp, dissecting every nuance of my playing. You must not let fear dictate your music. Remember, the sound of failure is as integral as the sound of success. It teaches, it humbles, but it must never silence you. His words lingered, and despite the weight of my nerves, I nodded. With renewed resolve, I positioned the violin under my chin, inhaling deeply. The bow met the strings once more, this time producing a richer, more confident tone. The notes wove through the room, fragile yet defiant, carrying the ache of ambition and the whisper of doubt in equal measure. As the final note faded into the quiet, I felt something shift within me, a fragile thread of strength spun from the very fear that had threatened to undo me. Marcus stepped forward, a small smile breaking his usual reserve. "You're stronger than you realize, Elise." I wanted to believe him. The conservatory had always been a crucible, a place where dreams could either be forged or shattered. And now, standing at the edge of my own breaking point, I understood that to survive, I would have to embrace both my fragility and my fierce determination. Later, as the day gave way to dusk, I found myself alone on a worn wooden bench near the conservatory's grand windows. The fading light spilled across the floor, painting long shadows and bathing the room in a soft amber glow. The silence was no longer oppressive but contemplative, inviting me to wrestle with the complex dance between hope and despair. The motif of fragile ambition echoed in my mind, the delicate balance, between reaching for greatness and the ever-present risk of falling apart. I knew the path ahead would be fraught with challenges, that the sound of failure would continue to haunt my steps. But tonight, I had tasted a new kind of strength born from vulnerability and the raw honesty of my own fears. Tomorrow, I would face the music again. And this time, I would play not just to prove myself to others, but to honor the fragile brilliance flickering within my own heart. The night deepened, and with it came a quiet promise that no matter how many notes faltered, the song would go on. The conservatory was a maze of sound and shadow, corridors that seemed to pulse with the collective heartbeat of countless practiced notes and whispered anxieties. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the cityscape, the golden light faded, leaving me alone in the practice room with Sophie. The air was thick with the scent of varnished wood and old music sheets, the faint echo of a piano drifting from the hall beyond. Our rivalry had always been a silent war, each glance, each performance, a subtle strike or parry. But now, as I looked into her eyes, I saw something I hadn't expected, a flicker of vulnerability. "You were pushing too hard," Sophie said softly, her voice almost a whisper, as if afraid the walls themselves might judge us. "We all are. Sometimes I wonder if it's worth it." Her words caught me off guard. The fierce competitor I'd always seen softened for a fragile moment, and I felt a strange kinship in that shared exhaustion. I nodded, allowing the tension between us to loosen just a fraction. "I don't know how to do anything else," I admitted, the truth bitter on my tongue. We lingered in that uneasy truce, the silence between us humming louder than any music. It was a crossroads for both of us where rivalry blurred into something more complex, a tentative understanding forged in the crucible of our shared ambitions and fears. Later, Marcus found me wandering through the shadowed corridors, the weight of the day pressing down like a heavy cloak. His presence was a balm, steady, unassuming, a quiet refuge from the relentless storm. We walked side by side, our footsteps muted against the worn stone floor, the distant strains of a nocturne weaving through the stillness. "You okay?" he asked gently, his eyes searching mine with an empathy I rarely let myself accept. I hesitated, then nodded. "I think so." He smiled, a small, genuine curve of his lips that made the world seem less daunting. "We'll get through this. Together." That word "together" resonated deep within me, a fragile thread of hope anchoring me amid the chaos. But the shadows of competition never fully receded. From across the crowded common room, Vivian's sharp gaze was a blade, cutting through the crowd with cold precision. Her posture was impeccable, every movement calculated to intimidate and control. I felt her presence like a storm gathering on the horizon, a reminder that the battle was far from over. After the bustle died down, I found myself alone before the grand piano in the empty hall. My fingers hovered hesitantly over the keys, the silence pressing against me like a weight. The notes I longed to play felt distant, tangled with the turmoil inside. Yet in that quiet, I confronted the fragile balance within myself, the fear, the hope, the relentless drive that both sustained and threatened to consume me. This chapter of my journey was a crossroads indeed, between rivalry and understanding, isolation and connection, despair and determination. As the echoes of my hesitant notes faded into the stillness, I knew the path ahead would demand everything I had and perhaps more. The night deepened, the conservatory settling into a hush that felt both ominous and full of possibility. Somewhere beyond the walls, the sound of failure whispered its haunting refrain, but so too did the faint, steady promise of resilience. And as I gathered my resolve, I realized that the true test was not only in the music I played, but in the fragile, intricate dance of trust and ambition I was learning to navigate. The crossroads stretched before me, uncertain and daunting, yet alive with the fragile brilliance of hope. The afternoon sunlight filtered through the tall conservatory windows, casting long, golden beams across the polished wooden floors. I had slipped away from the usual bustle, seeking refuge in the quiet sanctuary of the library nestled in a shadowed corner of the building. Shelves upon shelves of dusty scores and faded biographies lined the walls, their secrets waiting like silent witnesses. My fingers traced the spines absent-mindedly until a particular volume caught my eye, a collection of compositions once played by my father. As I pulled it from its resting place, a folded piece of paper fell to the floor, its edges yellowed and delicate. Heart pounding with uncertain hope, I unfolded the letter carefully. The handwriting was unmistakably his, hesitant, raw, and trembling with emotion. The words painted a portrait of a man trapped by circumstances, tormented by decisions made and the weight of unfulfilled dreams. He wrote of his love for music, for me, for my mother, but also of the crushing expectations and failures that chased him into silence and absence. Each line resonated with the ache I carried, the unanswered questions that had shadowed my every note and practice session. The letter did not offer closure, but it offered context, an unexpected thread of understanding woven into the tapestry of my life. I sat back, the fragile paper trembling in my hands, and allowed the raw truth to settle around me. The sound of footsteps approached, soft but deliberate, and I looked up to see Vivian Sharp standing at the entrance, her eyes sharp. Her usual confidence softened by a flicker of something unfamiliar, hesitation, perhaps, or doubt. We regarded each other in silence, the unspoken tension between us thickening the air. For a moment, I glimpsed beyond her polished exterior to the pressures that shaped her, the relentless demand for perfection, the fear of failure she so fiercely masked. This revelation unsettled me, complicating the rivalry that had defined so much of my conservatory life. Later, I found myself in Professor Alcott's study, the room steeped in the scent of old wood and memories. His silver hair caught the fading light as he listened patiently, while I shared fragments of the letter and the turmoil it stirred within me. His eyes, sharp yet kind, held their own shadows, the regrets of a life spent chasing brilliance at great personal cost. Ambition, he murmured, is both a flame and a burden. You must learn to carry it without letting it consume you. His words lingered in my mind as I stepped into the cool evening, the conservatory garden a quiet refuge from the day's revelations. Marcus awaited me beneath the arcing branches, the soft rustle of leaves framing our shared silence. His presence was a balm, steady and reassuring as we spoke of the fragile balance between expectation and self-acceptance. In his gentle voice, I found a tentative hope, a reminder that I was not alone in this delicate dance. As night fell, I returned to my room, the letter folded carefully and placed upon my desk. The path ahead was no clearer, yet I felt a subtle shift within, a fragile ambition renewed by truth, complicated by empathy, and tempered by newfound understanding. Somewhere beneath the surface, I was beginning to see not only the strings that bound me, but the glass through which I could reshape my own reflection. The conservatory, with its echoing halls and relentless demands, had not changed. But I had, and with each breath, each note, I was learning to play the music of my own becoming. The journey was far from over, and as I closed my eyes to rest, the question lingered in the silence. How much of myself was I willing to risk to reclaim the melody that was truly mine? The practice room was bathed in the soft light of a single lamp, its glow pooling over the worn wood floorboards and the scattered sheet music that littered the desk. Professor Alcott sat across from me, his silver hair catching the light as he regarded me with a rare softness. The usual sternness that cloaked his presence was replaced by something almost fragile, as if he were about to share a secret he had long kept hidden. Elise, he began, his voice low and steady, there was a time when I was not so sure of my place here, not unlike yourself. I leaned forward, my violin resting forgotten in its case. The weight of my own anxieties seemed to lift, replaced by a curious anticipation. I once had a performance, he continued, one that could have defined my career. But it didn't. I faltered in front of an audience that expected perfection. The sound of my failure echoed in that hall long after the last note died away. His gaze drifted to the window, where the first hints of twilight softened the edges of the conservatory's ancient stone. For years, I allowed that moment to define me. I buried the shame beneath layers of discipline and resolve. But eventually, I realized that vulnerability, our imperfections, are what give our music life. I swallowed hard, the confession stirring something deep within me. The relentless pressure to be flawless had always felt like a double-edged sword, a melody laced with sharp dissonance. Later that evening, alone in my room, I sat in the dim light, the recording device humming softly on the desk. I played back a recent rehearsal, a passage I had stumbled through, the notes wavering, the rhythm fractured. The sound of my failure was raw and unyielding, yet as I listened, it no longer struck me as a condemnation, but as a pulse, fragile and alive. The imperfections in the music mirrored the cracks in my own resolve, and for the first time, I allowed myself to see them as part of a larger whole, a mosaic of ambition and frailty. The next night, Marcus and I found ourselves on the conservatory's rooftop, wrapped in the cool embrace of the night air. The city lights flickered below us like distant stars, a reminder of everything beyond these walls. His usual calm demeanor was softened by a rare vulnerability. "Sometimes," he said quietly, "I wonder if we were chasing something we can never fully grasp. The perfect note, the flawless performance. But maybe it's not about perfection. Maybe it's about truth." I nodded, the weight of my mentor's words and Marcus's quiet wisdom settling around me like a fragile shield. Back in the grand hall, the place where so many of my fears had taken shape, I lifted my violin once more. The notes flowed, not with mechanical precision, but with a tender honesty that resonated through the space. Each phrase carried the weight of my doubts and hopes, the sound of failure intertwined with the promise of growth. In that moment, I understood that music was not merely a contest of skill but a dialogue between heart and soul, a journey through shadows and light. As the final note lingered, fading into silence, I felt a quiet resolve bloom within me, a determination not to be defined by the fear of failing, but to be transformed by it. The road ahead remained uncertain, the competition looming like a storm on the horizon. Yet, within me stirred a fragile harmony, a resonance born of vulnerability and strength. And with it, a hope that I could face whatever came next, not as a perfect prodigy, but as a musician honest enough to embrace the sound of failure. The night deepened, and with it, my resolve. Tomorrow, I would begin again. But even as I packed away my violin, a subtle tension lingered beneath the surface. The challenges were far from over, and the shadows of rivalry and expectation stretched long across the conservatory's halls. Yet, for now, I carried with me a new melody, a song of imperfect beauty, waiting to unfold. The conservatory's corridors hummed with the low murmur of hurried footsteps and whispered conversations, a constant undercurrent to the relentless pursuit of perfection. I moved through this charged atmosphere with a familiar blend of anxiety and determination, my violin case a weight I carried as much in spirit as in hand. The competitions had sharpened the air, fracturing old alliances and forging new, uncertain ones. Among them, Sophie Kim emerged as the most complex, more than just a rival. She was a reflection of ambition's many faces, her moments of vulnerability slipping through the cracks of her polished exterior. It was in one of the smaller practice rooms, tucked away from the bustling main halls, that I found the courage to reach out. Sophie was already there, her slender fingers absently tracing the contours of her violin's neck as if coaxing a secret from its strings. The room smelled faintly of rosin and aged wood, shadows pooling into the corners where the light from the lone window faltered. "Sophie," I began, voice tentative, "can we talk?" She looked up, eyes narrowing slightly but not with the usual sharpness of rivalry. Instead, there was a flicker of surprise, and perhaps something softer curiosity. "I suppose," she replied, setting her violin down with deliberate care. We sat opposite each other, the space between us both a barrier and a bridge. "This competition. It's tearing everyone apart," I said, trying to find the words that would not betray my own fears. "But maybe it doesn't have to be just about winning. Maybe there's room for understanding, even between rivals." Her laugh was soft, almost bitter. "Understanding, that's a dangerous word here, Alice. But maybe you're right. The constant pressure, the expectations, it gets to me too." For a moment, the rivalry that had defined us melted into shared exhaustion and unspoken hopes. We spoke of practice routines, the strain of parental expectations, and the loneliness lurking beneath the conservatory's grandeur. I sensed a fragile truce forming, a tentative acknowledgement that we were not so different after all. Later that evening, Marcus found me alone in the empty auditorium, the vast space swallowing the faint echo of my footsteps. His presence was a balm, a steadying force against the tempest inside me. "You're pushing yourself too hard again," he said quietly, settling beside me on the worn wooden bench. "I can't afford not to," I replied, fingers nervously tracing the grain of the bench. "The scholarship, the competition, it's all on the line." He nodded, eyes gentle but firm. "Just remember, you were not alone in this." His words lingered, a reminder that amid the fierce currents of ambition and rivalry, friendship could be an anchor. But even as I nurtured these new connections, Vivian Sharp's presence loomed like a shadow. I caught her watching from a distance during my conversation with Sophie, her gaze sharp and unreadable. There was a warning in that look, a reminder that any alliance I forged might be weaponized against me. That night, I returned to my practice room, the solitude both a comfort and a crucible. The bow met the strings with a haunting resonance, notes spilling into the stillness like fragile glass shattering and reforming. Each melody was a confession, a plea, a declaration of my tangled hopes and fears. As the moonlight filtered through the tall windows, I realized that the path forward was not just about mastering music, but about unraveling the complex ties that bound us all, rivals, friends and foes alike. The strings of glass that held us together were delicate and easily broken, yet within their fragility lay the possibility of something new. The chapter ended not with resolution, but with a question hanging in the air. Could I truly unbind these strings without losing myself? The conservatory, with all its harsh beauty and hidden fractures, awaited my next move. The afternoon sun filtered weakly through the tall conservatory windows, casting long, slanted beams of light across the rehearsal room. Dust motes drifted lazily in the air, their silent dance undisturbed by the tension that gripped me. My bow hovered above the strings, fingers trembling just slightly on the neck of my violin. Every breath felt heavy, every heartbeat a thunderous echo in my ears. I was poised on the edge of a fragile precipice, a single misstep away from shattering the delicate balance I had so painstakingly maintained. The piece we were rehearsing was unforgiving, demanding precision and passion in equal measure. I had poured countless hours into mastering its nuances, each note a thread woven into the tapestry of my ambition. Yet, as my bow slid across the strings, an errant movement betrayed me. A jarring, discordant note erupted, hanging awkwardly in the stillness like a sudden crack in glass. The sound was wrong, a dissonance that shattered the illusion of control I had so carefully constructed. My breath caught, a sharp stab of embarrassment flooding through me. The room seemed to contract, the walls closing in with the weight of my failure. I could feel the eyes of the others, Professor Alcott's measured gaze, Marcus's quiet concern, though the room was silent save for the lingering echo of that awful note. My hands trembled, the bow slipping slightly as I struggled to regain composure. Professor Alcott stepped forward, his silver hair catching the light as he approached with a calm, deliberate pace. His presence was steadying, a beacon amid the storm of my thoughts. "Alice," he said softly, his voice low but firm, "a mistake is not the end, it's a lesson. The sound of failure is part of the music, part of the journey. You must learn to listen to it, not fear it." His words, though gentle, cut through the fog of my panic. I swallowed hard, nodding slowly. The fear that had gripped me so tightly began to loosen, replaced by a tentative flicker of understanding. Failure was not a monster to be avoided, but a shadow to be recognized, an integral part of growth. Marcus, ever the quiet anchor in my turbulent world, sat just beyond the rehearsal space, his fingers tapping a steady rhythm on his knee. Our eyes met briefly, and in that glance, I found a well of reassurance. He wasn't judging me. He was simply there, sharing the burden of the struggle. His calm presence reminded me that I was not alone in this relentless pursuit. That evening, back in my small, dimly lit room, I cradled my violin with a new tenderness. The familiar weight of the instrument pressed against my collarbone as I traced my fingers over the worn strings, feeling the rough texture beneath my fingertips. The room was quiet except for the soft hum of the city beyond the window, a distant murmur that seemed to echo the tumult within me. I sat in silence, the memory of the discordant note lingering in my mind like a stubborn wound. Yet beneath the sting of failure, a fragile spark of something else began to glow, a nascent resolve, fragile but real. I understood now that perfection was not the goal. It was the courage to face imperfection that defined us. In the days that followed, I approached my practice with a different mindset. I allowed myself the space to falter, to stumble, and to learn. The sound of failure no longer echoed as a threat, but as an invitation to grow, to deepen, to embrace the complex dance of ambition and vulnerability. The conservatory, once a battleground of relentless pressure, began to feel more like a place of transformation. Each note I played carried the weight of my dreams, yes, but also the lightness of acceptance. The music was no longer a test of worthiness, but a language of truth. As I prepared for the challenges ahead, the haunting sound of failure remained a constant companion, but it no longer terrified me. Instead, it whispered a quiet promise that in every fracture, there is space for light to enter and for strength to emerge. And so, with bow in hand and heart open, I stepped back into the light, ready to face whatever came next. The music awaited, imperfect and beautiful, and so was I. But the journey was far from over. Just beyond the horizon of this fragile acceptance, new trials awaited, and with them, the echoes of ambition, rivalry, and revelation. I could only hold on to the fragile balance I had found and trust that it would carry me through the coming storm. The sound of failure was no longer a silence to fear, it was a melody to embrace. The morning light seeped through the tall conservatory windows, casting long shadows over the polished floors and rows of empty chairs. I had barely begun to tune my violin when a sharp knock at the door startled me. Marcus stood there, his usual calm expression clouded with unease. "Alice, you need to see this," he said, holding out his phone with a video paused on the screen. I frowned, taking it from him. The video was a recording of my last rehearsal, or so I thought. As it played, my heart sank. Vivian's voice was layered over mine, mocking, questioning, and deliberately misrepresenting my performance. The footage had been edited to highlight every minor mistake, every hesitation, and was spreading fast through the conservatory's social channels. Whispers followed me down the halls, eyes filled with doubt where once there was respect. I felt the walls close in. This was no accident. Vivian had orchestrated it. A cold fury ignited in my chest, but beneath it simmered a fragile ache of betrayal. How had I not seen it coming? How many had been in on this? The scholarship that was my lifeline now felt like a noose tightening around my neck. Backstage, the air was thick with tension. Vivian's icy gaze met mine, unrepentant and sharp as a blade. "You were fragile, Elise," she hissed, her voice low but venomous. "Maybe it's time everyone saw the truth." I clenched my fists, struggling to hold back tears of frustration and humiliation. The rivalry that had simmered beneath the surface for months now boiled over, raw and exposed. I wanted to lash out, to scream, but the fear of losing everything kept my voice steady, even as my heart faltered. Later, in the dimly lit practice room, I sat alone, pressed my violin against my collarbone, and let the silence fill the space. My fingers trembled as I drew the bow across the strings, each note a fragile thread in the tapestry of my resolve. The haunting sound of failure echoed in my mind, but beneath it, a spark of defiance flickered. I would not let Vivian's betrayal define me. That night, Marcus and I found ourselves wandering the empty conservatory garden. The soft rustle of leaves was a balm to my restless thoughts. "You're not alone," he said quietly, his gentle eyes steadying me. "We'll find a way through this." His words were a fragile bridge across the chasm of doubt that threatened to swallow me whole. I nodded, feeling the weight of uncertainty ease just enough to breathe. The breaking point had come, and with it a choice. To surrender to the shadows Vivian had cast, or to rise, broken but unbowed, into the uncertain light of tomorrow. As the night deepened, I knew one thing for certain: this was far from over. And so, with trembling hands but a determined heart, I began to prepare for the fight of my life, not just for my scholarship, but for the music that was the very essence of who I was. The days that followed were a whirlwind of whispered rumors and sideways glances. The conservatory, once a sanctuary of focused practice and quiet ambition, felt more like a battlefield. Vivian's betrayal had fractured the fragile equilibrium, turning friends into skeptics and allies into distant shadows. Professor Alcott's office door remained closed longer than usual, his normally steady presence replaced by an uncharacteristic silence. When I finally stepped inside, the weight of his gaze was both a comfort and a challenge. "Alice," he began, voice low and measured, "this moment will define you not just as a musician, but as a person. Your response will echo far beyond these halls." I swallowed hard, the sting of humiliation still fresh. "I don't know if I can," I admitted, voice barely above a whisper. He regarded me with a mixture of sternness and sympathy. "Strength isn't the absence of fear, but the courage to act despite it." His words lingered as I left the room, mingling with the distant strains of a piano sonata drifting through the corridors. The sound was a reminder failure was not the end, but part of the journey. In the practice rooms, Sophie Kim's presence was both a balm and a thorn. Our rivalry had always been complicated, but now, with the stakes higher than ever, her moments of vulnerability offered a glimpse of shared struggle beneath the surface of competition. "You can't let her win," Sophie said one afternoon, her voice softer than usual as she passed me a sheet of music. "Not like this." Her words, unexpected and earnest, sparked a fragile alliance. It was a small beacon in the storm, but enough to remind me that even in rivalry, there could be understanding. Every evening, I returned to my violin, the strings both a comfort and a challenge. The sound of failure that had once haunted me now mingled with the fierce determination to reclaim my narrative. Each note was a step forward, each practice session a battle fought and won in silence. The breaking point had passed. What came next was the fight for survival in music, in ambition, and in the delicate balance of hope and despair that defined my world. And as the day of the final performance drew near, I realized that this was not just a contest of skill, but a crucible of character. The choices I made now would shape not only my future at the conservatory, but the very essence of who I was to become. The sound of failure might echo still, but it would no longer be the final note. I was ready to play my truth. The door to my dorm room closed with a soft click, muffling the distant hum of the conservatory's bustling hallways. I sank onto the edge of my bed, the weight of the past hours pressing down on me like a relentless storm. Vivian's calculated betrayal was no longer just a shadow in my mind. It was a tangible wound, raw and aching. My fingers trembled as I reached for my violin resting against the wall, but the familiar comfort of its polished wood and taut strings felt distant, almost alien. I cradled the instrument close but didn't lift the bow. Instead, a hollow silence filled the room, echoing the emptiness I felt inside. The betrayal cut deeper than I had anticipated. It wasn't merely the act itself, but what it represented, the ruthless lengths to which ambition could drive someone, the fragility of trust in this cutthroat world. My scholarship, my dreams, my sense of self all seemed to teeter on a fragile edge. I closed my eyes, willing the storm inside to calm, but the cacophony of doubts only grew louder. A soft knock broke the silence. Marcus's voice, gentle, unobtrusive, called my name. "Elise, can I come in?" I hesitated, torn between retreat and the faint hope of connection. "Yes," I whispered. He stepped inside, carrying a steaming cup of tea, the aroma of chamomile and honey weaving through the stale air. Without a word, he handed it to me, his eyes steady, understanding. I accepted the cup, the warmth seeping into my palms, grounding me in the present. "You don't have to face this alone," Marcus said softly. "I know it feels like the world's against you, but you're stronger than you think." His words weren't empty platitudes. They carried the weight of someone who had seen my struggles and chosen to stand beside me anyway. The room felt less suffocating, the walls less like barriers. I let out a long breath I hadn't realized I was holding. The following day, Henry found me in the common room, his presence a balm to the frayed edges of my spirit. His easy smile and calm demeanor reminded me that beneath the fierce competition and whispered rivalries, there was still room for kindness and genuine friendship. We talked not about music or contests, but about simple things, the changing seasons, the comfort of familiar melodies, the quiet moments between chaos. In their company, the sharp sting of betrayal dulled, replaced by a growing sense of solidarity. I realized that the conservatory was more than a battlefield. It was a community, flawed but capable of nurturing growth beyond just technical skill or accolades. That night, standing by the window, I gazed out at the moonlit courtyard. The pale light cast long shadows that danced with the gentle breeze, and for the first time in days, I felt a flicker of clarity. My path was uncertain, marked by challenges and setbacks, but it was mine to walk. The fragile strings of glass I had feared snapping might instead reflect a complex beauty, a testament to resilience and the courage to embrace imperfection. I knew the road ahead would not be easy. Vivian's shadow still loomed, and the competition was far from over. But in that quiet moment, wrapped in the stillness of night, I found a fragile hope. A quiet promise to myself that I would not let the fractures define me, but rather shape me into something stronger, something real. The music inside me stirred once more, not as a weapon or a shield, but as a voice. My voice. And with it, a tentative step forward into whatever awaited beyond the shattered reflections of this chapter. The afternoon light streamed through the tall windows of the conservatory, casting long, warm shadows over the polished wooden floor. I sat by the window, violin resting on my knee, fingers idly tracing the delicate curves of the instrument. Outside, the branches of the old oak swayed gently in the breeze, their leaves rustling softly. The distant murmur of other students practicing created a subdued symphony of life, a reminder that I was not alone in this world of relentless pursuit. It was the first time in what felt like weeks that the conservatory hadn't pressed down on me like a storm cloud. Instead, it felt like a fragile sanctuary, one where I could breathe and begin to rebuild. I thought back to the harsh words, the betrayals, and the sleepless nights spent perfecting every phrase, every note. The weight of expectation had been suffocating. But now something inside me shifted, a quiet acceptance that perfection was both impossible and unnecessary. I lifted my violin carefully, the wood cool beneath my fingertips. Slowly, I drew the bow across the strings, coaxing out a tentative melody that wavered like a fragile glass sculpture teetering on the edge. It was imperfect, a little raw, but it was mine. Professor Alcott's voice echoed in my memory, his calm insistence that music was not just about flawless execution but about truth and vulnerability. That day, when he'd asked me to play a passage with more feeling and less control, I'd resisted at first. The idea of letting go terrified me. What if I failed? But as I experimented, allowing the notes to breathe, to falter and recover, I felt a weight lift. The music became a living thing, not a test. In the cafe later, Marcus's familiar presence was a balm. He listened without judgment as I confessed my fears and doubts, his gentle eyes steady and reassuring. "You're not alone in this," he said simply. "We're all trying to find our way. Sometimes it's about the music, sometimes about the courage to keep going." His words settled around me like a soft blanket, warming the chill left by rivalry and mistrust. Henry's cello at rehearsal was like a heartbeat beneath my violin's tentative song. Together, our music wove a tapestry of sound that felt less like competition and more like communion. For a moment, the harsh edges of ambition softened, replaced by shared purpose and fragile hope. The conservatory wasn't just a battlefield, it was a place where growth could happen, where broken things might mend. Still, the path ahead was uncertain. The competition loomed, and with it, the old fears and pressures. But now, I carried something new, a balance between striving and surrender, ambition tempered by vulnerability. I knew the journey was far from over, but for the first time in a long time, I felt ready to face whatever came next. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the room in a gentle glow, I lifted my bow again and began to play, this time, with open heart and steady breath. The music filled the space, fragile yet whole, a refrain of hope amidst the silence. And in that moment, I understood that even the most delicate glass could reflect light if held with care. The corridor behind the grand concert hall was a narrow artery of muted light and whispered breaths. I sat on the cold wooden bench, violin case open at my feet, the familiar scent of polished wood and rosin grounding me in the moment. My fingers trembled as I lifted the violin, adjusting the fine tuners with care. The distant murmur of the audience beyond the heavy velvet curtain was a reminder of what awaited me, the final movement of this relentless competition, where every note would carry the weight of months of sacrifice and unspoken fears. My heart hammered in my chest, a staccato rhythm that matched the quickening tempo of my thoughts. I had imagined this moment countless times, each scenario a different blend of triumph and disaster, but nothing could fully prepare me for the electric tension that hung in the air now. From the corner of my eye, I caught a figure approaching, Vivian Sharp, her presence as commanding and precise as ever. Her sharp gaze met mine, and a faint, almost imperceptible smile curved her lips, brittle yet somehow genuine. "Alice," she said softly, her voice a quiet challenge. "This is it. No more games, no more shadows. Just the music." I nodded, swallowing the lump of anxiety and resentment that had nestled deep inside me. "Just the music," I echoed, though the words felt fragile, like glass threads stretched taut. We stood for a moment in an uneasy truce, the rivalry that had defined so much of our time here, now laid bare between us. There was something raw in her eyes, an echo of the pressures I knew all too well. For a fleeting second, the mask of competition slipped, revealing the vulnerable girl beneath the polished exterior. "I've heard what you found out," Vivian admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "About my tactics. It's ugly out there. But so is this place." "It is," I agreed, my voice steady despite the swell of emotion. "But I'm done letting it break me." She nodded once, sharply, and turned toward the stage entrance. "Then show them, Elise. Show us all what we're really fighting for." I took a deep breath and followed, the sounds of the hall swelling around me, the rustle of programs, the soft shifting of feet, the low hum of anticipation. The stage lights blinded me momentarily as I stepped into the spotlight, the polished wood floor gleaming beneath my feet like a mirror reflecting my own fragile resolve. I lifted my violin, the instrument an extension of myself, its strings humming with the energy coursing through me. The first note quivered in the silence, tentative yet full of promise. As the music unfolded, I poured every shard of doubt, every echo of fear, into the melody. The bow danced across the strings, weaving a tapestry of sound that was at once delicate and fierce, a confession and a declaration. The audience faded away, replaced by the intimate world I created with every phrase, a world where ambition and vulnerability intertwined, where the sound of failure was not an end but a possible beginning. Each crescendo was a battle cry, each diminuendo a moment of fragile reflection. Halfway through, I felt the familiar tremor of uncertainty creep in, but I steadied myself with a memory, Marcus's calm smile, Professor Alcott's challenging gaze, my father's silent absence. They were all threads in the fabric of my resolve. The final notes soared, trembling on the edge between silence and sound, and then fell away like fragile glass shattering softly. The hall held its breath for a beat longer before the applause erupted, a wave of sound that swept over me, both distant and immediate. I lowered my violin, chest heaving, the exhaustion of months coalescing into a bittersweet triumph. Backstage, Vivian caught my eye again, her expression unreadable but less hostile. For the first time, I sensed not an enemy but a fellow traveler in the perilous journey we both navigated. The final movement was not just the culmination of the competition, it was the moment I confronted not only Vivian but my own fears and dreams. The music had become a crucible, forging a new understanding of what it meant to fight for my place, not just in the conservatory, but in the fragile, beautiful world I was determined to claim. And as I stepped away from the stage, the echo of the last note still ringing in my ears, I knew the journey was far from over, but for now, I had found my voice. The backstage corridor felt different now, less oppressive, the shadows less sharp. Marcus was there, his gentle eyes warm as he greeted me with a quiet nod. You were incredible, he said simply. I managed a wary smile. Thank you. I needed this. Professor Alcott appeared behind us, his silver hair catching the dim light. You've taken a significant step today, Elise, he said, voice steady but kind. Remember, it's not just about the notes you play, but the truth you bring to them. I nodded, feeling the weight of his words settle deep inside me. As I looked back toward the stage, the empty chairs gleaming like scattered stars, I realized that the final movement was only the beginning of a new chapter, a delicate balance of ambition, fragility, and the courage to face whatever notes life would ask me to play next. And somewhere, amid the lingering sounds of applause and whispered congratulations, I heard the faintest echo of hope. The finale was no longer a finale at all, it was a prologue. The conservatory was quieter now, the cacophony of the competition replaced by a stillness that pressed upon me like a weight I hadn't anticipated. I found myself back in the practice room where I had poured every ounce of myself into the final performance, the notes still faintly reverberating against the polished walls. Sitting there, the violin resting in my lap, I let the silence settle. It was not the triumphant crescendo I'd envisioned, nor the crushing defeat I'd feared. It was something in between, a fragile harmony of success and failure intertwined. The judges' faces flashed in my mind, some stern, others unreadable, as their verdict settled over me like a cool mist. I was neither the star they had expected nor the failure they might have predicted. Instead, I was something more complicated, something real, and that complexity unsettled me. Marcus found me in the courtyard later that afternoon, the soft rustle of leaves and distant bird calls providing a gentle backdrop to the unspoken tension between us. His presence was a balm, steady and reassuring. You played beautifully, he said quietly, his eyes searching mine for a sign of how I truly felt. I shook my head, a small, wary smile tugging at my lips. Beautifully isn't enough, not here, not anymore. He sat beside me on the cold stone bench, the warmth of his friendship enveloping me like a shield. Maybe it's not about being enough for them, he murmured. Maybe it's about being enough for yourself. The words lingered, seeping into the cracks of my doubt. In that moment, the rigid walls I'd built around my ambition wavered, making space for something gentler, more forgiving. Later, I found myself in Professor Alcott's office, the familiar scent of aged wood and fading ink grounding me. His silver hair caught the muted light filtering through the tall windows, and his eyes held a depth of understanding that transcended words. Elise, he began, his voice steady, the pursuit of perfection is a treacherous path. It can elevate us, but it can also imprison us. You must learn to embrace the imperfections, the fragile moments where your true strength lies. I nodded slowly, the weight of his counsel settling deep within me. It was not a lesson in complacency, but a call to a more nuanced kind of courage. The next day, as I walked the hallways, still wrapped in the quiet aftermath, I crossed paths with Vivian. Our eyes met, sharp, measuring, but beneath the usual edge, a flicker of something unspoken passed between us. It was not reconciliation, nor was it renewed hostility. It was an acknowledgement of the shared battle we had fought, the price we had paid. You surprised me, she said softly, a rare vulnerability threading her tone. I met her gaze evenly. So did you. In that brief exchange, the rivalry that had defined so much of my time here shifted subtly, revealing layers beneath the surface, layers I was only beginning to understand. As I left the conservatory that evening, the sky painted in hues of fading gold and deepening blue, I carried with me a new perspective. Success and failure were not opposing forces, but threads woven into the same fragile tapestry. And in that tapestry, I could find room for both my ambition and my vulnerability. The journey ahead was uncertain, filled with challenges yet to come. But for the first time, I felt ready, not because I was unbreakable, but because I had learned to embrace the delicate strength in being broken. The sound of failure was no longer a threat, but a part of the music I was destined to play. And so, with tense determination and vulnerable hope, I stepped forward into the silence that followed the storm, ready to compose the next movement of my life. The late afternoon sunlight filtered softly through the tall conservatory windows, casting long, golden slats across the polished wooden floor. I sat quietly beside Marcus in the practice room, the familiar hum of strings and keys weaving a gentle backdrop to the tentative peace that had settled between us. For the first time in weeks, the weight pressing down on my shoulders seemed to lift, if only momentarily. Marcus's fingers moved deftly over the piano keys, his music a warm undercurrent to my own tentative notes on the violin. Our melodies intertwined, a delicate harmony that felt like an unspoken promise that neither of us was truly alone in this relentless pursuit. "You sounded different today," Marcus said softly during a pause, a small smile tugging at his lips. "More hopeful." I ventured, eyes still closed, letting the last note linger in the air. "Definitely, it suits you." Hope was a fragile thing, but in that moment, it felt tangible. I opened my eyes and met his gaze, grateful for the steady presence beside me. The conservatory, with all its pressure and rivalry, suddenly felt less like a battlefield and more like a place where growth was possible, even if uneven and uncertain. Later, in the muted hush of the lounge, Sophie and I found ourselves alone, the usual sharpness of our rivalry softened by the shared exhaustion of endless practice and competition. The air between us was thick with words unspoken until Sophie broke the silence. "I never thought I'd say this," she began hesitantly, "but you re not what I expected." I raised an eyebrow, a small, wary smile playing at the corner of my mouth. "Neither are you." Her laugh was low and genuine. "It's strange, isn't it? How we spend so much time competing, but maybe all we really want is to be seen not just as rivals, but as people." That moment of honesty shifted something between us, a delicate thread of understanding weaving through years of tension. We were still competitors, but beneath that was a shared vulnerability, a recognition of the loneliness and fear that drove us both. The tension between rivalry and empathy grew more complex one evening, when I unexpectedly encountered Vivian backstage after a rehearsal. Her usual confident facade faltered, if only for a flicker, revealing the burden she carried beneath her sharp gaze. "You think you know me," she said quietly, eyes searching mine. "Maybe I do," I replied cautiously, "or maybe I'm starting to see that we both fight ghosts, just different ones." For a moment, the walls between us thinned, and I glimpsed the pressure that shaped her ruthless ambition, the fear of failure, the weight of expectations that no one else seemed to understand. It didn't erase our rivalry, but it made it more human, more complicated. That night, the conservatory's common room felt different. The hum of competition faded into the background as I sat with Marcus, Sophie, and Henry over steaming cups of tea, laughter threading through the quiet space. It was a rare and precious moment, a shared understanding that, beneath the ambition and rivalry, we were all just trying to find our place, to be more than fragile strings stretched taut by expectation. As the night deepened, I realized that the conservatory was no longer just a crucible of competition. It had become a community shaped by shared struggles and growth, where even the fiercest rivalries could soften into something resembling kinship. In this fragile harmony, I found a new strength, one not born solely from ambition, but from connection, empathy, and the courage to embrace vulnerability. The future remained uncertain, and the pressures unyielding. But now I faced them not alone, but alongside others who understood, who fought their own battles with equal fierceness and fragile hope. This new harmony, delicate and imperfect, was ours to nurture, a melody still unfolding, full of possibility and quiet resilience. And as I closed my eyes and listened once more, the notes sang of more than just competition. They sang of belonging, of acceptance, and of the endless, fragile beauty found in the pursuit of a dream shared with others. The conservatory's harshness had softened, and in its place, a new song began to rise, one of hope, of new harmonies yet to be discovered. But even as laughter filled the room and friendships deepened, I could not shake the feeling that beneath this fragile peace, the strains of ambition still hummed, waiting to test the bonds we had forged. Could these delicate connections withstand the storm, or would the relentless sound of failure once again fracture our fragile chorus? I did not know yet. But for now, I allowed myself to breathe, to hope, and to play, to embrace the imperfect, beautiful music we made together. The late afternoon sun filtered softly through the stained glass windows of the conservatory's library, casting fractured patterns of color over the worn wooden table where I sat surrounded by fragile papers and yellowed photographs. The silence was thick, broken only by the distant, tentative strains of a piano somewhere down the hall. I traced a faded letter with trembling fingers, the elegant script a whisper from a past I had never truly faced. My father's name was written across the envelope in familiar handwriting, a remnant of a life I barely understood. The years of absence, the silence he left behind it all echoed louder here, in this quiet sanctuary of music and memory. I unfolded the letter carefully, as if disturbing the fragile threads of history might shatter them forever. The words were tentative, a mixture of apologies and explanations, a glimpse of a man caught in his own torment and dreams deferred. He had been a promising violinist once, full of talent and ambition, but shadows had crept into his life, failures, fears and choices that had torn our family apart. For so long, I had carried the weight of his abandonment like a stone in my chest, shaping my own fears of failure and unworthiness. I closed my eyes, allowing the weight of those years to settle over me, feeling the ache and anger soften into something quieter, more complex. It was a beginning of fragile truce with the past that no longer demanded my defeat. Later that evening, I found myself in the small cafe near campus, the warm glow of the lamps and the murmur of quiet conversations a stark contrast to the cold isolation I had felt all day. Marcus was already there when I arrived, his familiar presence a balm to my frayed nerves. He smiled gently, his tousled brown hair falling over his eyes as he gestured to the seat across from him. "You look like you've been carrying the world," he said softly, stirring his tea. I hesitated, then shared what I could: the letters, the photographs, the tangled emotions. Marcus listened without judgment, offering only the steady warmth of his friendship. His quiet empathy made the burden lighter, reminding me that I was not alone in my struggle. "Maybe it's not about fixing the past," he said thoughtfully. "Maybe it's about making peace with it, so you can play for yourself, not for the ghosts." His words lingered with me as I left the cafe, a seed taking root in the fertile ground of my heart. The next day, Professor Alcott invited me to his private studio, a space filled with the scent of aged wood and the soft glow of a single lamp. He sat across from me, his silver hair catching the light as he spoke in a low, measured voice. "You remind me of myself, many years ago," he said quietly. "I carried my own shadows, doubts that almost broke me, but I learned that perfection is a myth. It's the cracks, the imperfections, that give music its soul." His story was a revelation, a mirror reflecting my own fears and hopes. For the first time, I allowed myself to see vulnerability not as weakness, but as a source of strength. That night, alone in the practice room, I raised my violin and let the bow fall across the strings. The notes spilled out, raw and unguarded, echoing through the empty halls. Each phrase was a release, a weaving of past pain and present resolve into something new and beautiful. The sound was fragile, yes, but it was mine, imperfect and shining with a quiet light. As the last note faded, I felt a steady calm settle over me. The echoes of the past no longer haunted my steps. Instead, they had become part of the music I would carry forward. I was no longer a prisoner of guilt or doubt, but a musician ready to embrace the uncertain future with open eyes and a determined heart. Tomorrow the conservatory would wake again with its relentless demands and fierce competition. But tonight, in the silence, I found a piece of myself I thought lost, a fragile strength that would guide me through whatever came next. And as I packed my violin away, the promise of new harmonies whispered softly in the air, a delicate balance between past and future, fear and hope, failure and triumph. The journey was far from over, but for the first time, I was ready to play my own song. The practice room was quiet, save for the faint rustle of sheet music and the occasional soft creak of the wooden floor beneath my chair. Late afternoon light filtered through the tall windows, casting long, golden shadows that reached across my violin, the polished wood gleaming softly in the sun's waning glow. I sat there, fingers lightly tracing the strings, feeling the weight of all that had come before this moment, the competitions, betrayals, fleeting victories, and the ever-present hum of doubt that lingered at the edges of my consciousness. I had come a long way from the anxious scholarship student who first stepped through these doors. Back then, each note I played was a desperate plea for acceptance, a frantic attempt to prove my worth not only to the conservatory but to myself. The shadows of my father's abandonment had followed me relentlessly, each failure a reminder of the dreams left broken in his wake. Yet here, in this quiet sanctuary, I sensed a subtle shift, something fragile, yet undeniable, taking root within me. The door opened softly, and Marcus stepped inside, his familiar presence a balm to my restless spirit. His tousled brown hair caught the light, and those gentle eyes, always so steady, met mine with quiet understanding. In his hand, he carried a cup of tea, steam curling upward in delicate spirals. "Thought you might need this," he said with a small smile, setting the cup gently on the edge of the music stand. I returned the smile, grateful for his steady companionship. "Thank you, Marcus. I've been thinking a lot today about everything. About who I was, who I am now." He nodded, settling down beside me. "It's a hard journey, that path. But you're not alone." We spoke quietly, sharing reflections on the competition, on the rivalries that once seemed insurmountable, and on the fragile alliances that had formed in their place. Marcus' calm demeanor helped me untangle the knots of anxiety that had tightened inside me for so long. His words were steady, grounding me in a way music alone never quite could. Before long, Professor Alcott appeared in the doorway, his silver hair shining faintly in the dimming light. There was a measured presence about him, a quiet authority that commanded respect without demanding it. He stepped inside, folding his hands behind his back as he regarded me thoughtfully. "I see you've been doing some serious thinking, Alice," he said, his voice low but steady. I nodded, feeling a mix of gratitude and nervousness. "I have. I'm beginning to understand that it's not just about the music or the competition. It's about who I am and who I want to be." Professor Alcott smiled, a rare softness touching his features. "That's a lesson many of us learn late, if at all." I too struggled with the weight of expectations, the fear of failure. But embracing those fears, rather than hiding from them, is where true growth begins. His stories of past regrets and hard-won wisdom settled over me like a cloak of reassurance. The conservatory was no longer just a battleground. It was a place of transformation, fragile yet potent. As twilight deepened, I rose and moved toward the large window that overlooked the city. The first stars began to appear, pinpricks of light against the deepening blue of the sky. The distant murmur of the city softened, leaving me in a cocoon of quiet. I breathed in deeply, the cool evening air mingling with the faint scent of aged wood and violin rosin. In that moment, I felt the delicate balance within me, the tension between ambition and vulnerability, hope and fear. It shimmered like glass, beautiful but breakable. Yet even in that fragility, there was strength. A promise that no matter what came next, I would face it not as a broken instrument, but as a musician who had learned to embrace every note perfect and flawed alike. The road ahead was uncertain, filled with challenges I could not yet foresee. But for the first time, I was ready to step forward with tense determination and vulnerable hope, carrying the sound of my own story into whatever future awaited. And as the night stretched on, the strings of glass within me refracted the light in 1,000 directions, each one a reminder that beauty and strength often reside in the most fragile places. The conservatory was quiet now, the usual hum of footsteps and whispered notes replaced by a stillness that felt almost sacred. I found myself lingering in the practice room, where so many of my battles had been fought and won and lost. The afternoon light filtered through the tall windows, breaking into shards of gold and shadow that fractured across the worn wooden floor like fragile glass. My violin lay quietly on the stand, its strings still humming with the echoes of recent performances, the weight of every note lingering in the air. Sitting there, I felt the familiar ache of exhaustion and relief, the kind that only comes after a long journey. when the destination is no longer a promise but a reality shaped by every broken chord and every triumphant crescendo. The past months had been a tempest, a relentless storm of rivalry, betrayal, and revelation. Vivian's sharp gaze, Marcus's steady presence, Professor Alcott's unwavering challenges all had been threads woven into the fabric of my existence here. Now, as I sat in the silence, those threads seemed to shimmer with a new light, revealing patterns I hadn't dared to see before. I thought back to that moment in the hallway, just days ago, when Vivian and I had crossed paths in a rare moment of quiet. Her usual sharp confidence had softened, the fierce edge replaced by something almost vulnerable. Our rivalry, once a battlefield marked by unspoken wars, had shifted. There were no grand declarations or dramatic confrontations, just a brief exchange of words, cautious and hesitant, as if both of us were testing the fragile ground between us. She had said, almost reluctantly, "You are not who I thought you were. Maybe. Neither of us are." I had nodded, understanding more than words could express. That moment had been a turning point, a subtle fracture in the walls we'd built around ourselves. It didn't erase the pain or the competition, but it opened a space for something new, respect, perhaps, or at least the recognition of shared struggle beneath the surface. Outside, the conservatory garden was bathed in the soft light of late spring. Marcus and I had wandered there earlier, the scent of blooming flowers mingling with the fresh breeze. He had spoken in his quiet, thoughtful way about the future, not just the immediate horizon of competition and acclaim, but the larger path we each had to find for ourselves. For once, the music was not the only language between us. There was a gentle honesty in his words that settled on my restless heart. "It's not just about the notes we play," he said, his eyes reflecting the pale blue sky. "It's about the spaces between them, the silence that gives meaning to the sound." I had smiled, feeling the weight of those words. They echoed something Professor Alcott had told me during one of our last lessons, his voice tinged with both pride and a quiet regret. "Perfection is a mirage, Elise. True mastery comes when you learn to embrace the imperfections, the cracks that let the light in." That lesson had stayed with me, a beacon through the relentless pressure and fear. As I prepared for my final performance, I understood that success was not a flawless execution, but a moment of truth, a fragile balance between ambition and vulnerability, strength and fragility. On the night of the final recital, standing beneath the stage lights, I felt the familiar tremor of nerves, but also a calm I hadn't known before. The audience was a sea of expectant faces, but my focus was narrow, honed inward. The first notes of my piece rose into the still air, delicate and trembling like glass strings pulled tight. Every phrase was a reflection of my journey, the tension of rivalry, the sorrow of loss, the tentative hope for what lay beyond. I played not to prove myself to others, but to be honest with myself, to give voice to the complex dance of fear and determination that had shaped me. When the final note faded, a hush fell over the room, followed by a swell of applause. But it wasn't the applause that moved me. It was the quiet realization that I had found a new kind of strength, one not born from perfection but from acceptance. As I stepped off the stage, I caught Professor Alcott's gaze from the balcony. His eyes held a mixture of pride and wistfulness, a silent acknowledgement of the growth he had witnessed. Marcus was waiting nearby, his smile warm and steady, and even Vivian's glance met mine with a flicker of something softer than rivalry. I knew the road ahead would still be uncertain, filled with challenges and shadows. But I also knew I was ready to face whatever came next with tense determination and vulnerable hope. Embracing the fragile brilliance of my ambition like strings of glass refracted by the light. In that moment, I understood that the sound of failure was not an end but a part of the music itself, a necessary, haunting note that gave depth and meaning to every other sound. And with that knowledge, I stepped forward into the future, fragile and strong, imperfect and whole. The conservatory's doors closed softly behind me as I walked into the night, the echoes of music fading but never truly gone. And somewhere deep within, a new melody was beginning, one shaped by all I had lost, all I had found, and all I was still becoming. The strings of glass were no longer a burden, but a prism through which I could see the world broken, beautiful, and infinitely alive.